28 or so.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Indian Rural Colloquy. Am I audible, sir? So today is the second session of the 12-part sessions that we have over the coming week, and we are very excited to have you here. Here are some of the collaborators of TRI, along with the TRI Center of Excellence as associations. More details on each of these will be shared in the chat at the end of the session. So you can watch out to your chat at around 6:30. We're excited to share with you an inspirational video created by one of our own to commemorate and celebrate the 79th anniversary of India's August Revolution. Sit back and enjoy.
जनता का आह्वान किया, वर्षों जकड़ी बेड़ियों को अब तो तोड़ो, क्रांति की मशाल जलागा तुम बोले, अंग्रेजों भारत छोड़ो, बहुत सहा गुलामी को अब ना सहेंगे, आजादी की बात रही वो लेके रहेंगे, हम करेंगे, हम मिलके करेंगे, हम करके रहेंगे, हम करेंगे, हम मिलके करेंगे, हम करके रहेंगे। उसी अगस्त की बेला में हम सौगंध उठाते हैं, सशक्त राष्ट्र के सपने को चलो मिलकर आज सजाते हैं, हर युवा को रोजगार मिले, हर नारी की आजादी हो, हर घर स्वास्थ्य सबल बने, ये गली गली मुनादी हो, हम करेंगे, हम मिलके करेंगे, हम करके रहेंगे, हम करेंगे, हम मिलके करेंगे, हम करके रहेंगे। गांव गांव अब विकसित हो, जन जन स्वाभिमानी हो, देश में ना रहे गरीबी, विकास ही अपनी निशानी हो। एक क्रांति फिर ऐसी हो, रगों में वही रवानी हो, कंधे से कंधा मिलाकर सबने बस यही ठानी हो। हम करेंगे, हम मिलके करेंगे, हम करके रहेंगे। हम करेंगे, हम मिलके करेंगे, हम करके रहेंगे।
Moderated by Madhu Krishna, Deputy Director at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This session draws on insights from leading feminist practitioners and thought leaders on improving women's participation in development programs while simultaneously focusing on building capacities of practitioners to bring impact that is both just as well as equal for women. I'll now request Anirban sir to introduce the panel and take the session forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Charvi. So a warm welcome to everybody who has joined us today. This is the second conversation of this series. We had a very excellent discussion yesterday focused on the picture of rural and the emerging opportunities. The discussion laid out an entire set of complex development challenges and the green shoots which give us hope and confidence to attempt transforming rural India in our own lifetimes. This discussion yesterday has set the stage for us to do a thematic deep dive over the next 10 conversations. Today, we take our first thematic deep dive as we focus on gender equality and justice. Today, the conversation is focused on deepening our understanding on structural challenges, practical pathways, and learning from the national and international experiences. Today, we have with us a distinguished panel, and I have the good fortune of working with three of them. Let me introduce the panel today. Sarojini Ganju Thakur, she was an IAS officer who retired as Chief Secretary in Government of Himachal Pradesh after over 3 decades of service to the nation. She established the National Gender Center at the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration and continues to mentor serving officers across the country. She was also head of gender in the Commonwealth Secretariat at London. Then we have Sunita Dhar, which many of you would already know. She has over 3 decades of experience on women's rights, gender mainstreaming, and advancing women's leadership within the civil society organizations in India. She was with UNIFEM, which now is called UN Women, at the South Asia and the New York office. She was one of the founding directors of South Asia Women's Fund and a core group member of Sangat. She also served as director of Jagori, which is one of the leading feminist organizations in this country. We have Professor Sanjay Srivastav. He is a well-known academic with deep interest in the areas of gender and globalization, urbanism, urban culture, and issues around masculinity. He has been a British Academy Professorial Fellow at the School of Global Affairs, King's College, London. He has several publications to his name. He is currently affiliated with the University College, London. We thank him for joining in from Australia at this late hour. And lastly, the session will be moderated by Madhu Krishna, who is the Deputy Director at India office of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She brings with her a diversity of experience in wide-ranging fields, including private, public, and not-for-profit sector. She has been a development professional for over 25 years with special focus on program design, evaluation, policy, and advocacy across various initiatives. She is deeply interested in gender, social, and economic equity. Before I hand over to Madhu, let me go over the housekeeping. Please use the chat box to agree, disagree, put in your comments related to the discussions which are going on. And if you have any specific questions, please use the Q&A box which is at the bottom of your screen. With this, looking forward to an exciting 1.5 hours. Handing it over to you, Madhu.
Thank you, Anirban, and again, a warm welcome to everyone. I'm really honored to be moderating this session. I hope everyone can hear me. So just if the panelists can give me a thumbs up for Anirban if you can.
Yes.
Okay. So wonderful to be here on this very important topic, and especially in 2021. As you all know, India has reiterated its commitment to SDG 5, both towards gender equality as a standalone goal for ensuring women's voice, choice, and security, as well as gender equality as a cross-cutting priority for all sectors and goals, including education, health, nutrition, employment, and environmental goals. These kind of international commitments have been an important step in the right direction. But we all know that as a country, we have a long journey ahead towards achieving gender equality and equity. In fact, for 2019-2020, India ranked a pretty low 112 in the Global Gender Gap Index. And there are also other worrying trends that have only been exacerbated by the current pandemic, which is one of the most important ones, is the continuing decline in the labor force participation rate for women. So at the foundation, we strongly believe that women's economic and their social empowerment are inextricably linked. And that unless we address barriers to both and strive very hard for gender equality and the advancement of women, we will actually fail in achieving any of our development goals. So unless we do this, we will not be able to advance any of our health and education, very pivotal goals and outcomes there as well. The other critical piece for us is this whole focus on unpaid care work. According to one study, as people know, women and girls put in a more than 3.26 billion hours of unpaid care work every single day. And this is from the Oxfam study around time to care. That figure in itself is pretty astounding, that we don't count any of this work as productive work. And it's also more shocking that 66% of women's work is unpaid compared to 12% for men. So the huge inequity, if there is any glaring inequity in the world, is this gender inequity. And of course, if women's unpaid care work is actually recognized, it would contribute almost 20 lakh crores to GDP, which would be 20x the education budget of the country. So for there's no disputing the data, but we all know most of this data. It is in the interest of everyone to bring forth gender equity as a human rights justice issue, long overdue, with very specific ways forward, which I'm sure our panel, our very eminent panel is going to show us the way forward. When we were discussing this panel, we said, we all know a lot of the barriers and the gaps, but really what we need to know is now what has really worked, both nationally and internationally. It's not as if the efforts are not there, but what is it that we can actually do as a future? And what has really changed with COVID? Because all that COVID has done is only brought into glaring limelight all of the inequities in the world between the rich and the poor, both nations as well as societies, between those who live in better service areas, if you think about infrastructure. But the cross-cutting theme is the huge amount of gender equity that has come forth. And all of these data points are only pointing to that. They've only got worse. Obviously, there's been some progress, but many, many poor people have been pushed further back into poverty. So I think we have multiple barriers that we can address for women that limit their social and economic empowerment. And these barriers, unless they're addressed and addressed quickly, many of the other initiatives that have been put in place will remain pretty siloed and will not give us the kind of impact that we are all looking to achieve. So today, as I said, I'm very honored to have with me three pivotal gender champions, Sarojini, Sunita, and Sanjay. And each of them is a pioneer in their respective fields and actually have done so much work to move the needle, the thinking, and the kind of frameworks that we need to continue this journey forward. And I hope today we'll have an engaging and insightful session, not only to share their experience, but also how we can accelerate some of this progress that we've seen further. So without saying much more, let me get started with my first question. Just again to reiterate, please post your questions in the question and answer section and comments in chat, and we'll make sure if you do address them to specific panelists that they're all shared with them. So firstly to Sunita, I know your journey has been very long, from even longer than I would say the Beijing commitments in 1995 to the recent Generation Equality Forum. According to you, what are some of the biggest gaps and areas that need more resourcing and attention that would help us accelerate? And some insights from you on some great global examples and national examples. So I'll start with that, please.
Thank you, Madhu. Thank you, TRIF, Anirban, Anish, and friends. And hello to everybody, co-panelists and participants. It's 27 years literally to Beijing conference. India was very active in the NGO forum as well as in the formal negotiations for the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995. And what was very unique was the large numbers of grassroots women's groups from all over the country, from various sectors representing various communities, who went to Beijing because it was the Fourth World Conference and the first of its kind that was held in Asia. So there was a good partnership with an interagency forum of donors, gender champions and others. And so Beijing also taught us that not everybody can go to a conference, but women's lived experiences and voices can be taken by those that go. So the principle of representation, women speaking of their own lived realities and making available translations for them so that you don't only have to use English as the spoken language in an international conference, representation, voice, and accountability. And so women were carrying the power of many women who couldn't be there in person. So there were 12 critical areas that the Beijing Platform for Action covered. And we learned a lot about women in poverty, education, ending violence against women, human rights, also looking at national machinery, the girl child, etc. But there were some critical issues that were left out 25 years ago and also continue to be left out. The voices of and the participation of women with disabilities, the voices of trans and those that have, gender non-conforming groups, the voices and participation of sex workers, etc. So on the one hand, and also issues of climate justice and all did not get enough coverage. While the Beijing Platform for Action was endorsed by so many countries and became a global document to be adopted by the national machinery, by national policies, etc., the biggest gap was that it was never resourced enough. There was no clear financial investments. And not having that both at the global level, at the regional level, at the national level, meant there was commitment, but where were the resources to walk the talk? And I think that is something we have learned. And if you come to today, the Action Coalition, there are 6 action coalitions of the Generation Equality Forum. One of the huge achievements has been that at the end of July, when the commitments were made at the Paris Forum, there were billions of dollars and millions of other investments that were committed by foundations, member states, donors, and alliance building for very unique kind across the 6 thematic areas. So resources are very important. We have to acknowledge that the agenda moves forward because women's organizations on the ground, grassroots collectives, citizen groups, social movements are deeply committed. So it's your unpaid care work that, of the women that the development agenda rests on, because even national budgets are pretty low. So if we look at the fact that what have we achieved? Because after Beijing, what did we have? We went through the MDGs, we went through the SDGs. So all that the critical human rights agendas that were not covered in Beijing was covered in the SDGs. We had a special target on gender equality and ending violence against women, which was completely missed out in the MDGs. And in Action Coalition, there are 6 targets that 6 themes that have been centrally, being looked at. What has also changed? We were young women then at Beijing, diverse women from very different class, caste, community, religious backgrounds, from academia, practitioners, grassroots leaders, panchayat leaders, etc. Today, what are we seeing in Action Coalition? There's talk about shifting the generation, the voice of younger women, of younger youth, of trans persons, of LGBTQI. So we're also looking at a generational shift, not in tokenist terms, but truly at being at the table for policy shifts, for making decisions, for being part of the process, and for leading change. And therefore, there's a demand by the younger generation to have mentorship processes in place, to give them a chance to create a transformative agenda for societies, for communities, and for families. But we still see that post-Beijing, there are still 2.1 billion women and girls that will live in countries that have not achieved any gender equality targets by 2030. There was a commitment in SDG 2030 to meet most of the gender equality targets. And we know that with the onslaught of the pandemic and other pandemics, domestic violence, other forms of targeted and intersectional forms of violence and discrimination, this is far off a goal and a vision to achieve. We also know that no one country has met with all the targets and the goals of the Beijing agenda. So it's not about only some of our countries. I think across the world, there's a lot to be done. And to do that, I think we have to forge new alliances. As I said, work across the generations, build better data. We still don't have gender disaggregated data across many of the variables, data on age, sex, gender identities, people living with disabilities. We also need to invest into transformative leadership, and we also need governments to really walk the talk. Political will is required and resources. Now, with all these investments at the international level, new coalitions, new ways of working together, working with different others, bringing in boys and men, working with diverse groups. But most importantly, I think we have to put rural women, women from the grassroots, urban, rural, tribal, young people at the center of change. I will say more later. Thank you.
Thanks, Sunita. That's really great. It's a great segue. So I'm going to move to Sarojini, because you touched on some of the points that really are at the country. We have to see the impact. While there have been a huge amount of resources promised at the Paris Forum, how do they actually translate into making lives of women in countries really much better than they were? And I think there's no a better person than you, Sarojini, to help us understand how large-scale programs across India, both public and private, can actually institutionalize gender equality as a kind of core outcome for themselves. Is there enough data? I know that Sunita talked about that. So what are the big steps that we've taken, and what do we need to take further to make this invisible kind of, women being invisible really much more visible? So over to you, Sarojini.
Okay, thank you very much, Madhu. And first of all, hello to everyone, all the participants, the co-panelists. And thank you, Sunita, because I think you've laid the background for what I'm going to say, with painting a sort of canvas, a picture of what has happened globally, what the global agenda has been, and what some of the gaps already are. Now, coming to the context of India, first of all, let me just say as a background that, we have made in the last 70 years huge progress. Let's not forget that. If you think in terms of education, in health, life expectancy, there are lots of areas where we can claim huge progress. Having said that, there are, and Madhu referred to some of them, there are persistent gender inequalities, and some are not getting any better. It's a source of concern, whether it's declining sex ratios, the workforce participation rates, so let's see that there is scope for change. Things have changed. And I think one thing which has changed very visibly, and I think that's for the better, is first of all, if you turn the clock back 30 years ago, gender was not in anyone's lexicon. People thought it's a grammatical word. I remember going to a conference where somebody said, "What's gender?" We only learned about it in school as masculine gender and feminine gender. So the first thing to remember is that we have made progress, but there's a lot to do. Now, how does government function? One thing which Sunita highlighted, and I think it's at the heart of any change, is for any change to happen, two things are required at least. One is, of course, the political will is critical, but also if you want to change something, you have to see what the nature of the problem is. So the issue that you raised, like we have a whole lot of programs in India for women, but I think what we need to understand is the lens through which we look at women and how they are included. Women in a lot of programs in India are seen, very much from the vantage point of them being mothers, home carers, etc. So there's a whole lot of programs which deal with social protection, pensions, ICDS, antenatal care, postnatal care. There are a whole lot of programs which deal with women like that. But frankly, women are everywhere. And those programs constitute a small, minuscule minority of the whole involvement of women. Let's just take agriculture. Agriculture today, full-time farmers, 75% of them are women. Now, do 75% of the resources go to women for their programs? Does it translate in investment? No, it doesn't. So what do we need? And I think that's the first thing. And I'm just reminded about what, I don't know if many of you have heard of this wonderful economist in 30, 40 years ago, Marilyn Waring. She's a New Zealand, she was a minister also, she was a feminist economist, and she talked about counting women in. And I think that's the critical component. You have to be able to count women, disaggregate data to see what women are doing. So the first thing is you need to, in each sector, doesn't matter which, see how do women come into the development discourse? What are the roles they are doing? What is the use of the infrastructure? I'm just cutting across sectors, is that you have to see how women, it's not, it's quite interesting that at least in agriculture, about the gender division of labor, and it's quite clear what women do, etc., though it's not counted and women are not recognized. But there are sectors, such as, if I think of transport, urban planning, where women are totally not part of the discourse. It just doesn't enter into the planning thing, which is absolutely, sort of thing, because women, there's a lot of data to show, for instance, that women use, in a lot of European countries, use public transport much more than because that's counted there. And it's a very interesting thing. I remember reading an article, and I'm just giving it to you as an example, about Sweden in 2011, when they were trying to bring gender equality. And the Scandinavian countries are at the top of the gender equality thing. So there was an interesting thing where they had a lot of snow. And the question came up was, what does snow clearing have to do with women? So they said, the traditional thing was to clear the roads and let the snow pile up on the side streets. And then they started asking women. And the women and the population said that actually we need the side streets because we use the side streets. We take our babies' prams down there. We walk to the grocery store. And they found out that most accidents that occurred slipping on snow actually occurred on the side streets. And that eventually there have been studies to show this actually cleared the side streets first that year. So just a question, just a lens to see that. And they found over a period of time, they actually found that this saved in healthcare because there were not so many accidents of people slipping. And it was easier for cars to drive with 3 inches of snow than it was for people to walk with that kind of thing. So what I'm saying, every area, you can't invisibilize use. Parks, and I want to give you examples because I want to tell you how people have brought in lens. You know, in a lot of parks, big areas are dominated, and this is about urban planning, are dominated by men playing sports. And women do not find, they're almost kind of inched out. And this happens all over the world. So there was, again, progressive mayor, again a woman, who came and said, why is it that women are not using the parks? They're beautiful spaces. And what they discovered was that the entrances, that there were too few entrances to the parks, and men would collect there, where women felt unsafe. So they broke up the park into smaller areas. And that has become the model for development of parks in Vienna. So what I'm trying to just highlight is that areas which you do not think of, roads, urban planning, of course, which is very obvious, the whole issue of safety in transport, which we come back to. I mean, all these areas actually meet women's needs. And there's such good initiatives. And that's what I want to tell you, that there are very good examples. And I think Sunita, I hope, will talk more because she was at the heart of it, of the Safe City program, which came about in Delhi, where they, in fact, organizations started mapping, you know, what areas were safe, etc. And she would be better. So first thing I want to say is that every area has gender. So the importance of counting, let's not. The second thing I want to say is that we do have, and this coming back a little bit to what Sunita said, a will expressed through the fact that the government, both at the central government and at the states in India, has actually committed to doing gender responsive budgeting. And budgeting is not only about, you know, it is about putting money in gender sensitive interventions, but it's after an analysis. And for that analysis, you require gender disaggregated data. So gender budgeting is a very good entry point that we have, which people are committed to, and we need to explore and see how we can use it better to ensure that we come up with more gender sensitive interventions. Of course, my proviso to that is don't spread yourself thinly. At least I feel always that it's better to go for depth. Let's choose 2 or 3 sectors, show results, than go all over the place and not be able to do. So that's the second thing. The third thing I felt it's important to say is that, you know, we have to hold accountability is a big thing. So my only thought is that, you know, I don't know how many of you have heard, has anybody heard of this thing called Long Friday? This is an amazing thing that happened in Iceland. It was in the 70s or 80s, where one day the whole country, which is very small, not more than, I don't know now, but it's about 300,000 people, where everybody decided, all the women decided no work, neither unpaid nor paid. And what they did was they actually, men took over. And soon after that, they had, you know, men realized, and they passed an act called the Gender Equality Act. In England, there's a gender equality duty. So all I'm saying is we need to start thinking also of accountability and responsibility. I think I probably should stop here. I have a lot to say about the childcare and unpaid care thing, but maybe I should come back to it in the second round.
Thank you, Sarojini. Really great points. Thank you for being so clear, and I love the examples. I think the large point I'm taking away is that we can't be gender blind, and often in many sectors we think we can just go ahead and be gender blind, and it's really important. While we don't spread ourselves thin, it's really important to see what impact programs have on women, and we have to be equitable in the way that planning is done. So it's really important to look at all sectors to say whether we are being at least gender equitable in the way we think about them and not be gender blind, because many programs, even the very obvious ones like agriculture, can turn out to be gender blind. So it's really important to bring that. I'm coming to Sanjay, who has really done an amazing amount of work on a very important part. Women can't get the outcome we need alone. We need very strong partnership for men. So Sanjay, coming over to you and having heard the discussion so far, and based on your own work around masculinity, what role do you think men can play towards moving these gender outcomes? And what are some of the barriers that men face in both being these champions and what holds them back? So over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers, and thanks to Sunita and Sarojini, because it also makes my task easier not having to do a preface. One of the fundamental shifts that happens in terms of feminist analysis of gender is to explicitly start thinking of gender as a relationship. Right? So as soon as you, in terms of universities, when people talked about women's studies and then start talking about gender studies, then automatically you're thinking about a relationship between men and women, between men and others who don't identify as either men and women, for example. So that's really fundamental, because it's important to understand, if you're going to understand that if we are coming to grips with what happens with women, we have to understand the structures of power within which they are situated. And that structure of power is one where men have control over what women might do. So it's really important to think about empowering women, but we have to work out what are the structures of power within which they are already embedded. Who are the people who have the dominant role in that structure of power? And in most societies, certainly societies such as ours, it is men. So the first significant thing is to always think of gender as a relationship, and as soon as we do that, we begin then to think about, well, what are the sites where this relationship unfolds, right? And then, is it the family? Is it the schools? Associations that men are part of? Because that then leads to much more practical notions or practical ideas of where does one intervene, is one is interested in ideas of women's autonomy, women's empowerment, etc. So once we understand gender as a power, gender as a relationship, and then we think of those sites where these relationships happen. As I said, these sites are multiple, right? Bureaucracies, schools, religion, for example, families, associations that men are part of, and that's where I think the practical part of what people who are working, activists, for example, who are working gender issues, come to intervene, to think about where these power relationships happen. It's important, I think, also to, in a lot of this work, not to think of something that is theory that people at universities do and something that is practice. I mean, it's not a very useful distinction at all, because at every point in time, all of us are doing theory and all of us are doing practice. So as soon as as soon as we have an idea, we are essentially theorizing about the world. Because the other thing that's happened very importantly in terms of the collaboration between, say, academics and NGO people, I certainly work with a lot of NGOs, is the breaking down of the idea that some people do much more abstract things and some people do practical things. And that's I've always found a very specious kind of a distinction, because it does not allow you to move beyond much more, I think, what have been somewhat problematic aspects, not very useful parts of activist work on gender, which is that a lot of people in the activist sector would often say to me, well, we need to measure things. And I think for me, one of the strongest feminist principles is the fact there are some things that if you cannot measure something, it doesn't mean that these are not important things. And quite often what happens, a lot of work on gender studies, is you often have these scales. And people will do, for example, an intervention program, and then they will be asked to say, well, how do we measure it? Can you just tell us in 3 years how men have changed? And I think in terms of practical work, it's very important to get away from the notion that you can actually, in a short term, measure changes in men's attitudes, for example. Because gender, as both Sunita and Sarojini pointed out, is a very complex part of human life, very complex social process. So I think that if you're thinking about how to operationalize how people have theorized gender, there are certain very important things to understand. And one of the most significant things is to understand what are the qualitative ways in which we can understand change. We don't necessarily have to quantify it at every step and say that these are the quantifiable ways in which we can say, things have changed. What are the ways in which, what are the measures that we can develop as people who work in the field to understand how, for example, a man's attitude might have changed in a qualitative manner? And sometimes it's not possible to quantify. Quite often people say that their projects might have failed because you can't quantify something. And for me, that really goes against every feminist principle about how you understand change, because you cannot understand power through this whole notion of quantifying. So firstly, gender as a relationship, if you're doing practical work. Secondly, what are the sites? Where does this relationship unfold? And how do we understand these sites? Because once we understand these particular sites, that's when the practical work of intervention happens. So a lot of work that I'm familiar with, for example, in India, for example, in Uttar Pradesh, there was used to be a program called Men's Action to Stop Violence Against Women, where they worked with men in rural and semi-rural areas. They got together with men who were interested in change, but did not have the context that they could find other men to talk to, because otherwise they would be made fun of by other men. How is it that you're interested in ideas of feminism, for example? So many such programs have worked in rural areas, have identified men who may be interested in working on these topics from those communities, but have had no vocabulary, have had no context to actually link up with other men. And finally, very significantly, I think what's important is to train men who are interested in working in these areas, working with women's organizations on topics of gender and power, is to provide training, is to provide the vocabulary for talking about masculinity. Because that's not a vocabulary that people have had. Because, masculinity is in a sense, of course, while we think that men are a very visible gender, masculinity is actually a completely invisible category. Because we never think of masculinity as something that's worth analyzing, right? Simply because it is considered to be universal, because it is considered to be It's not something that you need to analyze. Whereas what is considered its apparent opposite, femininity, is considered to be worthy of analyzing. And I say apparent because that's the other thing we need to remember in terms of practical work, that something called femininity is not the opposite of masculinity. Something called femininity is always an inferior category, because the manner in which we think of femininity is the manner in which we come to construct masculinity as a superior gender. So what I'm saying to you is that what is really important if you're interested in practical work for people who work in NGOs, who work as activists, is to actually think that there is no distinction between practice and theory. That this is a species that is not a very useful distinction itself, and to identify those sites where masculinity unfolds, to think about how these sites, families, schools, associations function, to think about what would motivate men to change. Why would someone in a position of power want to change after all? Who gives up? Who willingly gives up power? Why would someone willingly give up power? And then think about the work that has already been done. And there are examples, as I said to you, work in Uttar Pradesh, there's work in Africa. A lot of work in masculinity in Africa actually began in the time when HIV/AIDS was very, very at its peak, because it was found that the most significant process of transmission of AIDS in Africa and Asia, for example, was not homosexual AIDS, right? It was heterosexual AIDS. Because it was men would have, that's how the category men who have sex with men emerges, because it was found that there were many men in India and many parts of Africa for whom homosexual activity was a lifestyle activity. They didn't necessarily identify as gay, because that to identify as a gay man would be seen as a feminine person. So they would have sex with other men, then have sex with their partners and wives and pass on the AIDS infection. So a lot of work in Africa was actually done with men during the era at the height of the AIDS epidemic. And that work translated very theoretical ideas. How do men view themselves? Why don't men in Africa and Asia identify themselves as gay, even though they may have having sex with other men? Why? Because theoretically, academics suggested because men who identify themselves as gay might be identified as more woman-like. So you never identify as a gay person, but someone who has sex with other men. So it's important then to link these apparently abstract ideas to ideas which are of very practical consequence, certainly in our part of the world. And I think these are some of the ways in which we need to think about masculinity, why it is important, how do we link ideas which seem abstract and theoretical and their importance for everyday practical work, and what are the schemes that have worked. And finally, I'm always at pains to emphasize that when we think about what has worked, it is not necessary to be able to quantify everything and say that in 3 years' time, this is the percentage in which men change or didn't change. That it is just as important to think about the qualitative ways in which we understand power dynamics, the small ways in which men might have changed, the different ways in which different kinds of interventions might be useful for changing men, and finally to ask, why would someone in a position of power want to change? And that's a fundamental question for any kind of practical work, which borrows from feminist theory, but is interested in ideas of masculinity and the relationship between men and women in this particular context we're talking about here. And I'll stop.
Thank you, Sanjay. Really important construct. I think one of the important sites that's coming out, especially since we're all getting a little bit more, isolated, is the family site. And we're seeing two parts to that. One, of course, is this huge increase in women's care burden because of the pandemic. The second issue is, of course, around the gender-based violence, as more and more people are getting, and women have much less access to their social network, and there's much less social pressure in some sense. And of course, men are stuck at home as well. So one of the frustrations is that you can take that out on the women. So that pandemic is very real as well and far more dangerous in some sense to women. So I'd like to ask Sarojini if you can comment a little bit on the care burden. Is something you had touched upon when you were saying that you'd like to come back to it. It's really an issue that is often underfunded. I'm always reminded that while there is some drumbeat, and in fact, there was a lot of international drumbeat, we don't see the echoes and the reverberations in India so much. There isn't much general population concern around it. It doesn't yet come out even in policy. Some of your thoughts on that, and then Sunita, I'll just ask you also to comment a little bit on that, but really, I know you've done a lot of work on the gender-based violence and violence against women. And that really, again, is becoming almost a bigger pandemic than what we're seeing with the COVID impact. So I'd really like your thoughts on that. So maybe first to you, Sarojini, and then Sunita can
See, when it comes to care work, and care work encompasses so much of the reproductive functions, the child care, the fuel, the water, etc. There is so much normalization of what women's roles are, even in the perception of the state, in the sense that if you look at the programs, and I'm just looking at Ujjwala, which was a great program to reduce drudgery by giving gas connections, but it focused on women as the people responsible for cooking. You saw the images of that. So that image gets perpetuated. Now, one of the things that Sanjay also was talking about was the need to look at gender as a relationship and the institutions that perpetuate certain ways of looking at things. So this unpaid care is something which in a sense, in many schemes and programs, is kind of almost normalized as a function. And if you see, even in some community kind of work, quite often, you know, there's some unpaid community work, which is also pushed on to women, because the assumptions are that women have, because they're not in paid labor, the unpaid remains visible. Having said that, the recent time use survey, I think, was actually, because it was the first time use survey done across the country, it actually very clearly demonstrated the gap between men and women's leisure time. And in that sense, the the importance of focusing more and on the fact that so much is unaccounted for. I think the second thing is that a lot, even if you look, and I say this lens is perpetuated, if you look at the maternity benefit scheme, it's for the formal organized sector, whereas most women are in the informal sector. So what I would say is that what is required really is that, not required, but what we need to do is have greater accountability. And I think that's where civil society organizations, etc., have often shown the way of an alternate way of doing things. So I was just thinking, for instance, if how do you, in a sense, make this unpaid care more visible, is by quantifying, by recognizing the fact that you need some redistribution roles. And in some ways, what is important is women in public spaces. Because if you start seeing, it's very interesting. There was a study done about how men and women split domestic roles when women are in Panchayati Raj institutions. And it was very interesting to see that as far as childcare, etc., men were quite willing to come in and help. So what we need is, I was just saying, and we made a beginning, women in Panchayati Raj, but to try and have more women in all spaces in a critical mass. And I'm underlining that critical mass, because unless you have enough women in such positions, change will not come. And I'm just thinking about programs like Kudumshri in Kerala, where over 40% of women are in this collectivized mode, where they can bring about change and do things differently. And it sort of acknowledges a lot of the work that they're doing. So and also they're able to claim spaces which otherwise they couldn't do. So I think one thing about unpaid care is the need for more visibilization, more collectivization, which happens when you have self-help groups. And I just want to stress something about self-help groups. There are self-help groups and self-help groups. And self-help groups really need to, there needs to be quite a lot of process of enhancing awareness about gender relationships and power relationships. And when that starts happening, then there is much more clarity about roles, etc. Not all self-help groups do it, because a lot of them do it. I mean, there are some very, very good programs, like we've had, in Orissa, some very good programs. We had the Swashakti project. There are lots of things where this awareness has been part of the self-help group thing. And NRLM is also, trying it. In some states it's more successful, in others it isn't. But also, I think what we have to recognize is, for instance, this very progressive thing that happened, I can't remember which year, but in the, like the fact that this unpaid care is actually holding women back from more productive paid labor is something that we also need to think about, because we have huge investments in the ICDS program. And I think it's only in Hyderabad or in Andhra and Telangana, or maybe it was Telangana, where they actually increased the hours of the Anganwadis from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. so that it actually allowed women to work and realized that this unpaid care was actually not allowing them to go into the more formal workforce. So what I'm saying is that it's important for us to redesign also wherever we have, and now it's part of the NEP, this whole preschool and childcare. It's very important that we actually acknowledge the kind of time that women do in work. And this is, of course, not only true of India, it's true throughout. So I think
maybe, Sarojini, sorry to cut you off because we have a little bit time and then we want to keep time for questions. So I'm going to ask Sunita if she can also please comment on the two issues, maybe a little bit more from the civil society perspective on unpaid care work, and then more on the gender-based violence that have come up as a huge issue, as a barrier, but exacerbated by this pandemic. Sorry, Sarojini, for the intervention.
Yeah, thank you, Madhu. I think that Sarojini's already talked about the unpaid care work and the fact that because we don't respect and don't acknowledge unpaid care work, you also see the devaluing of the work of domestic workers. And therefore, their access to social protection, fair wages, having a policy. We have the ILO C-190 convention, which India still has to ratify. And we have to understand it's because we devalue certain kinds of work as compared to other kinds of work. That is something that the macroeconomic system needs to look at, policymakers need to redefine. Now, when it comes to gender-based violence, it is something that has been with us for a long time. And I agree with Sanjay, statistics do not explain everything. But the recent WHO study that just came out, I think, last year or early this year, still says that 1 out of 3 women experience violence across their lifetime, particularly intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And this starts early, between 15 to 24 years. Now, this is also what a study that when I was at Jagori, we had undertaken in Delhi and some of the other cities. And this data talked about young women, young girls going to schools, to the markets, studying, going out, face this kind of violence. And we know that violence is preventable. The kind of focus and attention COVID-19 got as a health issue, not enough, of course, it should have got much more. Violence did not get this issue. We have a twin pandemic. Violence is an older pandemic. Violence against women, girls, across communities. And I think we need to understand, as Sanjay said, it is a power relationship. Those that are in positions subscribed by society to be more vulnerable, less powerful, etc. And therefore, we have to understand that violence against women and girls is reinforced by structural inequalities of power, gender inequalities. And it is also intensified, as I said earlier, by multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. I think we have to understand that. Today, intersectionality is a lens we need to use. No longer can function in a binary way. Intersectionality, as we have learned from Kimberly Crenshaw and many other feminist theorists and others, we need to use this lens because not all women have the same experience. Not all women lead similar lives, men, women, boys, girls, etc. The other thing is that we need a human rights-based approach. No longer we can live in society where we're looking for, out of the constitution rights, community is defining the Kap Panchayat kind of definition of what should be done. The realm of culture where the human rights of persons are not respected. I think we need to get away from this kind of community and social norms that devalue certain people in society. From certain communities and within the household. So what would one do if one were to look forward? One of the things that we have found and I found from my work is, of course, we need to address individuals and find services for individuals facing violence, girls. Is that the home is no longer a safe site, right? Sanjay talked about sites of violence. whether it's gender sex selection, whether it's negligence in sharing of nutrition, food, access to opportunities, etc. So we need to address the systemic nature of violence, and we also need to address the fear of violence. It's that fear that restricts mobility, restricts choices. Young girls today have to decide whether they can wear jeans. Just look at something that happened recently. 17-year-old young girl who wore jeans in UP was murdered by her grandfather, that too from a family, and then hung on the bridge. So the choice, self-censoring yourself, thinking twice about what should I do, when should I go out, all of these restrictions, being blamed, being shamed, all of this kind of stuff really needs to be addressed. The mindset change needs to happen. We all need to step back. We all need to make changes as individuals, within families, within our communities, and also within our organizations. Let's not be very pious and think it doesn't happen in our workspaces. There is everyday sexism, there's everyday misogyny, there's an everyday microaggression at workplaces. And women in the fields, women in public spaces, women in the informal sector are facing structural as well as everyday microaggressions, sexual assault, and harassment at their workplace. So therefore, it's very important for us to look at safety across home, communities, workplaces, private institutions, government, etc. I think that's something we need to work on, which means that we have to understand, we need legal literacy, we need to understand our laws, and we need to implement much better coordinated response systems for survivors, as well as fair system of justice for everybody. The second thing is that we really need to invest in prevention. We always wait for the crisis. A case has to happen. And then you realize the organization has never done any training. People don't know what the policy framework is. I think prevention is the key. We have to invest into prevention, child, school education, college education. Online, during the pandemic, online, not only domestic violence, but online abuse and work from home harassment had increased in numbers, looking at the numbers in India. We also need to build the evidence, because the data that's collected also does not get disaggregated. Who's most vulnerable? Has the case really been resolved? So sometimes you only know about complaints. You don't know whether the redress system has worked, whether access to justice was there. So I think some bit of tracking access to justice, access to services, rebuilding one's life, etc. These are things we need to know. Otherwise, we're only stuck with numbers from the police station, which we know is only the tip of the iceberg. We need, of course, legal reforms, and we certainly need, the criminal justice system needs urgent repair. I'm really sorry to say, but our SOPs, maybe across the world, but in our country, need urgent, reworking. We need to develop the SOPs that work for every survivor of violence, boys, girls, men, women, trans, whatever. And we also need to focus more on restorative justice, not retribution. Demanding a death penalty, thinking that that is going to reduce violence, has it? Not at all. That is where restorative justice principles are extremely important. And we also need to provide protection to witnesses. If witnesses are threatened, if a woman complains against her own family member and she's under threat and she's being silenced and stigmatized, and women's organizations who support her are also being silenced and threatened, then there's going to be hardly any complaints that will be made. So, the confidence building measure for every survivor is very important. And I have found that in my work with self-help groups and women's collectives, what amazing progress they have made to support each other, to build solidarity, to mediate, to find out what the system is, and to demand accountability from their local agencies, knowing very well that all the agencies do not work in a coordinated way. And I think that's where, constructive partnerships would help, Madhu and friends. We all have to work together.
Sure.
Women's safety is not women's organizations' work, excuse me. It is everybody's work, not only an obligation of the state, but the due diligence has to be done by every institution, every NGO, every community, panchayat, whatever. And we have to make sure that accountability is rested there. And that's why we need far more resources. We find that the women's ministry is women and child, 90% for children, less than 10% for women. Maybe we need a women's ministry. maybe they will have more resources, maybe far more one-stop centers, far more redress. Because when I look at the global statistics, and this is my last point, Madhu, because I work for a women, I have been working with women's funds. And one of the things that we are seeing in the 2018 data is, let me look at the data, which says that in 2018, less than 1% out of all gender-focused aid, which was 48.7 billion, reached women's rights organizations. So a radical reallocation of resources is called for. So if we have to end violence, create safe spaces, safe communities, safe, safety across, and if everybody is committed to it, transformation will come, and women and men. And that is where work with men, boys is very crucial as partners in change. And there are enough examples in the country on the same. Thank you.
Thanks, Anita. And I think we have to develop a huge intolerance for any kind of violence, but especially gender-based violence. I think it's a great framing. I know that, Sanjay, we're kind of at time, but I'd just like to ask you to talk a little bit about urban safety, infrastructure investments that we're making, that and work on safety, because I really think that more than even the unpaid care work, I think the gender-based violence has become very normalized. If you talk to people, it's just taken, oh yeah, he beat up his wife a couple of times, they had this thing, etc. So there's a lot of acceptance, even in schemes, government schemes, etc., that really look at the crisis before there is anything preventive. So would love to know what are some of the infrastructure investments India can make to prevent gender-based violence and assure women's safety.
Sorry. Yeah, I think, it is really important to think of the gender of infrastructure, because we tend to think of infrastructure as something that is about cement and cranes and wire mesh, etc., etc. But it's important to think about the gender of infrastructure. What are the ways in which we build cities, for example, or we improve villages, build infrastructure in villages, in rural areas, that actually don't address how these building programs directly or indirectly affect how gender is practiced, how gender unfolds. So let me give you an example. Currently India has this massive 100 smart cities program, which is about better internet connectivity, which is about more bridges, which is about clearing certainly crowded areas and making more public spaces, etc., etc. But in almost none of the detailed project reports that I have seen, gender has been discussed, not in one single place, which is extraordinary, given that, as both Sunita and Sarojini have said, one of the most significant ways in which gender operates is through ideas of space. What are the right spaces for men? What are the right spaces for women? And historically, we know that what happened is that what's happened is that so-called public spaces are seen to be men's spaces, right? And that so-called domestic spaces are seen to women's spaces. And yet we have large amounts of investment in the making of public spaces in the country, whether it's cities or in rural areas. So we need to think carefully about, when we invest in infrastructure, what are the gendered aspects of this? When we are building so-called smart cities, how do we address the idea that, for example, public spaces are spaces that can be occupied by all genders? Quite often, well-meaning men will say, well, of course, women should not be harassed in public spaces. But, in public spaces, women should behave as women, like women, which is a discourse of protection, which is that if women behave and act in a particular way in public spaces, they will not be harassed. That if they don't wear certain kind of clothes, they will not be harassed, etc., etc., which is, of course, not true at all. So what we need to think about in practical terms is, whenever there are programs of large-scale infrastructure, what is the gender? What is the gender dimension? What are the ways in which, for example, CCTV technologies actually end up acting as technologies of surveillance, quite often for women, because, rather than technologies of safety? What are the ways in which certain areas that are being redesigned, what are the ways in which they provide aspects of safety? And quite often what happens in many of these new infrastructure technologies, that they're about clearing out spaces. So often there'll be argument about, there are lots of street vendors in this particular area. As a lot of research shows, including Jagori's research, that crowded streets are not a bad thing when you're thinking about women's safety, think about safety in general. That in fact, it is this clearing out that is a problem. So we need to problematize very specific ways in which infrastructure developments in India and other parts of the world, for that matter, are utilized, are put into place without thinking about the gender dimensions of this. There's been some very interesting recent work. For example, there's a recent book on the metro in Delhi, which is called The Moving City, which is by an anthropologist, which looks at how metro stations, for example, are places where lots of young couple meet, young women meet with their boyfriends or partners who may not have other spaces to meet. So what are the ways in which we can think of gender as something more than a technical project? What are the ways in which we can think of gender as something, infrastructure development as something more than just a series of surveillance technologies? What are the ways in which at its very inception, whenever there are plans for infrastructure, we can begin to contribute to those plans in terms of thinking of the gender of infrastructure. And and the most significant example I give you is the smart city paradigm, which is extraordinary, that we have 100 cities around the country that are being redesigned, that have been refashioned, that hundreds of thousands of crores of rupees and dollars have been poured into, but there's not a single word in any of these documents that I've seen that has to do with gender. That is to say that implicitly then, what infrastructure programs become in our country, that they implicitly become, they normalize the existing structure of gender. That is, they normalize the existing structure of masculinities and patriarchy, because we don't address it. And if you don't address something, you are automatically going along with what exists rather than problematizing what exists. And I'll just leave it at that at this particular level.
Thank you, Sanjay. I think all of you have made very important points. And the other really running thing which we don't have time to go into, because most of what you've said is really around also narrative building, right? So when we think about how crime is reported, it's always someone is at fault, the victim is at fault. When we report a robbery, we say robbers attacked. But when we report rape, we say the girl was raped and she was out late at night or she was wearing different clothes. So it's also a huge shift in narratives, which is a whole different discussion. Hopefully at TRI, if we can organize something around how the gender narrative also shapes some of this. So just also, as you're saying, you just take what you have and then you kind of implement from infrastructure to programs. So I think that's also a very important theme. So I just want to actually start with you, Sanjay. One key message that you'd like to leave with the audience, and then I'll go around to the three and then open it up for questions. So quickly, in maybe 30 seconds, one key message that you'd like to leave with the audience.
Well, one is the key message is that I think we have to think of gender as having a history. That is, it is changeable. That if something that is not the same across time, is not the same across space, number one. And secondly, change is, while statistics are very important, it's important to have statistics on how many women, for example, suffer domestic violence. Statistics are not as important to say that in a given period of time, we can measure how people's attitudes have changed. And I think that's I want to make that point very strongly, because a project fails not because it is not able to quantify changes in gender attitudes. That it is very important to think of qualitative messages. And that's very important for everyone who works at the coalface of gender change. That we need to think of, if you're really seriously interested in feminist principles, think of the qualitative ways in which we think of change rather than think of change as a quantitative measure to say precisely how did men change. Well, we don't know, because no one gives up power easily. And I'll stop it.
Thank you. Maybe to Sunita next, and then we'll end with Sarojini. Thank you. One key message that you want everyone to take away.
I always say this, and I'm going to say it again. It's some lines from Kamla Bhasin's poetry, and something that we all sing, and we celebrate equality and change and all. So, tum khud ko badal, tabhi to zamana badlega. This was the message for women's groups when they were being organized, mobilized 20, 30 years ago. But we are also saying, हम तो बदल गए लेकिन ज़माना को भी तो the society also has to change, no? So each one has to undergo a process of change. You cannot make change for somebody else. If we do not practice the values and principles and the power relations, as Sanjay was saying, change our gender, relations within our communities and our societies, families, then how will change take place? And we should not be afraid to make change. I think sometimes we are afraid. We generalize it by saying that it's because it's part of our society, whether it's marriage, whether it's making decisions, whether it's, your choice voice. I think each of us can make a significant change, and together then only change will come. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sunita. Last words to you, Sarojini, and then we'll go to question and answer. One key message you'd like to leave with the audience.
I think she's not there in the meeting right
now. Oh, has she left? I still see her.
Hello, no, I'm here. Sorry, I was just muted. What I was saying is that in every, my key message would be that in every area of work, it doesn't matter what it is, whether you're working in forest, health, education, transport, I think it's very important to see what the relationship of women, men, and trans are with that sector. In that sense that how do they use it? What are the roles they play? What are the responsibilities? What is the use they make of that sector or the resources in that sector? Because only then will we be able to begin to understand what the differential needs are and what the differential needs, etc. are. So I think that's very important. And the second thing I feel is that we need to be also slightly more accountable for gender equality. I think I know change comes, but sometimes I'm thinking even in a lot of European countries where the indices are much better in terms of progress, what they found was that gender does tend to evaporate, and you need to be responsible for ensuring that. And I think all of us who are in public domain, etc., should realize that it's a responsibility and a duty,
Thank you so much. I don't think I've moderated or attended such a valuable learning session, because each of you have given us so much to ponder and to discuss and to think. But I'd love to open this out for questions. Anirban, can you help me please with any questions that you've already gathered?
Yeah, so some of the questions have been answered on the chat, on the answered section. You can open and see. But there are some questions which have come right now, last couple of minutes. Sejal,
I have one. I have some of them open. Should I just ask them? Okay,
please.
Right. So I have one. What are the possibilities to? Oh, so does collectivization of women through SHG network help in mainstreaming gender? And is there any scope to improve further? Would any of you like to take it, Sarojini or Sunita?
So I heard, does collectivization of women
through the SHG network help in mainstreaming gender?
See, I think collectivization of women is important because it gives women sort of common purpose, common interest, and the possibility of empowerment. The fact that they work in solidarity with each other, it creates that space. It does help to mainstream gender because it thrusts women from the private space into the public space. So there is a possibility, because once they're collectivized, they take part in a lot of development activities. So it is a mode, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, process is very important to ensure that change takes place within the women themselves.
Thank you. We have another question.
Madhu, can I just answer that? Just an addition to the collectivization.
Yeah, please go ahead, Sunita.
Yeah, just to add, I think what's happening is that we also tend to fall into the trap of collectivizing women into groups from similar social backgrounds. I think this model is not going to work. We have to have diverse members in every collective. Then we will learn to work across diversity. We'll be more inclusive. We will understand the work on the ground in a more complex manner. So just my point there.
Thank you. Rashmi has said that, while women form a big part of even the formal workforce as frontline workers or grassroots workers, but their number drastically reduces as you go up the leadership change and decision making. So even at block level positions, we don't see many women. So is there, what efforts can be made to change that? Or is that a comment, Rashmi? There wasn't a question in there. I just see that as a comment, but is there some way to change that?
Well, many states have already, sorry, should I?
Yeah, go ahead,
answer?
please, sir. No, please go ahead.
What I was going to say, many states have already got quotas all down the line. Not all states do. So that's one positive way to change. And one thing we have to realize is that a lot of the frontline workers actually perpetuate the care function, which we do in the family, also in the public space. And you would find that a lot of the frontline workers, also their work and their contribution is devalued greatly in terms of the contribution they make to health, etc., when you think of how important a role they play. The other thing I just want to quickly say that when it comes to recruitment, I know the system looks as if there's equality, but biases are very, very deeply ingrained when it comes to recruitment and when you view women as supplementary earners. And it's very interesting. I mean, in some public service commission, I've been shocked to hear that they actually asked women, state level public service commission, why they needed a job. Because in any case, they would be married and they were already, with a family. So I'm just saying this is reality. And I just quickly want to give you an example that they did some, and this isn't only in India, let me tell you. Biases exist everywhere. And it was very interesting. There was this, even for musicians being chosen in symphony orchestras, they found they kept taking men. And it was only when they did blind, listening to the music or audition that women started being taken. There are lots of examples of this kind, throughout. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. There's an important question from Darshan. She says, how can organizations factor in the cost for creating women-centric programs? That could be additional cost to the family for counseling for women, entrepreneurship programs, or cost for owning digital assets. So is there a bias in the question because you don't count those costs for men, or fixed costs in terms of opening daycare centers for skilling programs? Does anyone want to take that question?
I would ask for evidence.
Yeah.
I would really ask for evidence that when resources come to every organization, I'd like a gender lens to be put to it. Where do they go? How do they flow? Who are they invested in? I think that kind of data is very important because there are a lot of assumptions that that women are getting a lot of resources, women's organizations are getting a lot of resources, but at the macro level, other level, wherever data is available, that's not true. But it's not really about, it's about sharing the resources. It's not about men versus women versus this versus that. I think at the end of the day, we have to see where do we invest into building capacities? Where do we invest into building infrastructure? We have heard in this conversation and know otherwise that we need specific gender sensitive infrastructure if more women have to participate in the productive workforce. We know in India that number is awful and it's declining. So we have to restructure the way we look at everything, the rural areas, the urban areas. People live between the urban and the rural. They're not located in only one space all the time as workers. And I think at the end of the day, we're not investing into rights of workers, social protection, their wages, their quality of lives. Even the smart cities that Sanjay is talking about, is it really looking at those people that are servicing it, the informal sector workers servicing the smart cities? Are they anywhere in the policy framework? These are the questions we should be asking. Thank you.
Yeah, two questions that touch on, asking for some.
I think Sanjay had his hand up there.
Sanjay, go ahead, please, if you're adding something. Sorry.
No, just very quick point. Often when I think people say, well, what about the costs of having these different kinds of facilities for women? I think that question often comes from a long history whereby almost most acts, public policy acts are actually have been acts that actually have been directed at men. So every time there's a little departure, we think this is odd, because historically what we are used to, what we've normalized is, and we've never questioned, is the fact that almost all public policies are have been men-centered. It's like when you're reading a book, even you read, oh, he did this, he did that, and if the author suddenly writes, she did this, it looks a bit odd, because what we're used to reading is that the universal subject is always the male. If you read a book, it says like a school textbook, which says, oh, he went to school, he played, and if that author says she went to school, she played, it to the reader who's used to the he, it looks very odd. So in a similar sense, when things happen, where infrastructure that is devoted towards things that have not been devoted to earlier, it looks a bit odd. That's because the balance of power has always been on one side. Well, just small point.
Thank you, Sanjay. Very excellent point. I was trying to get to that, but thank you so much for putting it so well. So a question that many have asked: what are some specific things that civil society organizations can do to take gender equity further? So maybe I ask each panelist to give one very specific action that CSOs and others can do to bring greater gender transformation in their programs. So maybe I start with you, Sunita, this time, and we'll end with Sanjay. So Sunita, okay. Sarojini, and then Sanjay.
I will focus on one area because I'm on several committees in the government and NGOs on the sexual harassment committees. And I do see that while organizations have committed to the policies, there's no training, there's no prevention work, there's no explanation, there's no training of the committee members as well. And so therefore there are different interpretations of what sexual harassment is all about. And I think we really need to invest into creating an equitable, safe, just working space for all. And secondly, I think what is also very important and which we should be doing is building a gender diversity and equity policy. We think that everything that's inequitous in an organization can be answered by the sexual harassment policy. And I don't think that can happen. We need a separate gender diversity and equity policy also as a redress system. Thank you.
Thanks, Sunita. Sarojini, to you. One specific recommendation.
Yeah, I think what civil society organizations can do very effectively, and they've started doing it and they are doing it and have done it constantly, is to play that watchdog role, to enhance accountability of the systems that exist, whether it's in terms of looking at the budget, looking at where investments are being made, what impact it has on gender equality, etc. I think some articles are all constantly being written and so on. But I'm talking about a general watchdog role because I think it's critical for someone outside the system to show and reflect what is actually happening.
Yeah, and I think everyone's voice is super powerful. If you just tell, I just believe in best intent and maybe oversight, or as Sanjay said, historic things that we imbibe. If you just ask the question, I find very good response and a ripple effect that goes through. So, and that's across public and private. You just have to ask the question, have you looked at women in this? Have you looked at gender equity in this? And then it starts at least starting a dialogue. So thanks so much. Sanjay, to you.
I'll make a comment and link it with one of the questions which says, how do we divert more funding to programs that deal with qualitative aspects like toxic masculinity, as most donors focus on quantitative data? It seems to me, and I keep going back to this because, I mean, in 2000, just after 2012 rape case, a group of us were asked by the University Grants Commission to write a report. It's called the Suction Report, where the report was about, ostensibly about sexual harassment, what to do about it. But we ended up writing a report which was never seriously taken up because it I think it was too problematic for the government to take it up. And I think what civil society organizations use, if they can be very helpful, is to be able to further the aims of that report that academics don't have the power to further, because that report actually dealt not just with sexual harassment and rape, but with an entire discussion on the meaning of patriarchy, masculinity, urban space, rural space. It seems to me the most fundamental thing that CSOs can do, or civil society organizations of different kinds can do, is to make normal the discussion of things that don't have immediate answers. You know, that because that is the most significant thing, because in media discourse and public discourse, what is often required are answers that have immediate consequences. And, you know, in the field of gender, that's very difficult to do. If we can normalize discussions that don't have immediate answers, but are not irrelevant to addressing gender issues, that would be an extraordinary contribution, seems to me, by civil society organizations.
Thank you. Every single person. I think there were a lot of comments in the chat as well as in the question answer. A lot of people wrote comments and very valuable comments. So Anirban, may I request the TRIF team to please put those as well as part of the report out if you are doing of the session, because I think they're very important comments and reflections from this session. I think there'll be some more requests because truly I believe I have to offer really grateful thanks on behalf of TRIF, on behalf of myself at the foundation, and I'm sure on behalf of all of the audience, to a very, very enlightening session, very educative. Thank you to all of the partners. Thank you to TRIF for organizing this session. Sanjay, do you have a point to make?
So there's a question about the Saksham report. I can send it to Anirban and he can maybe circulate.
Yes, he can circulate it.
Which is, is done by some of the most eminent feminists in India. So it'd be very, I certainly think it's a good report. So.
All right. Thank you so much. And again, you will get more resources. I know that Anish has been putting in a lot of resource links in the chats. Again, grateful to TRIF for all of that thoughtfulness in designing this session and for supporting me. So thank you again to all of you. And hopefully panelists, you will be available if participants would like to engage in some one-on-one conversations over email, etc. So again, thank you again to TRIF. Thank you very much to all the panelists and of course to the audience for sparing your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Madhu.
Thank you. Thank you.
Madhu.
Yeah. Thank you, Madhu, for this. And this was great. I just enjoyed it, and 90 minutes was too little for the topic. We could have gone on for another hour, I think.
I think we could go on for several years, Anirban, but now all at least vow going out of this session to do our bit for gender equality, because I think that was a very powerful ask from Sunita to all of us. Thank you.
So thank you for the people who have joined us. We look forward to you joining again tomorrow. We have 2 exciting sessions tomorrow. Please do register and join us tomorrow. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.